Nightmare at midnight. It was a night like any other, or so I thought, until the clock struck midnight, and the world around me transformed into a nightmare. I found myself alone in a dimly lit room, the air thick with an oppressive sense of dread. As I looked around, I realized that I was in an unfamiliar place, a decrepit mansion that seemed to creak and groan with a life of its own. Shadows danced along the walls, their movements unsettling and erratic. Fear clenched at my chest as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. How had I ended up here? And more importantly, how would I escape? But before I could find any answers, a chill ran down my spine as I heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the hallway outside the room. They were slow and deliberate, like the footsteps of a predator stalking its prey. With a sense of growing unease, I realized that I was not alone in the mansion. There was something else here, something sinister and malevolent that lurked in the darkness, waiting to pounce. As the footsteps drew closer, I knew that I had to find a way out, and fast, with trembling hands, I began to search the room for any means of escape. But it was no use. The windows were boarded up, and the door was locked tight, trapping me inside with whatever lurked in the shadows. Panic threatened to consume me as the footsteps grew louder, drawing ever closer to the room where I stood frozen in fear. I could feel the presence of something sinister just beyond the door, its malevolent energy permeating the air. And then, with a suddenness that took my breath away, the door burst open, revealing a figure cloaked in darkness. Its eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light as it advanced towards me, its movements slow and deliberate. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched desperately for a way to defend myself. But there was nothing I could do against the creature that stood before me, a creature born of nightmares and fueled by fear. With a sense of resignation, I closed my eyes and braced myself for the inevitable. But just as the creature was about to strike, I heard a voice that cut through the darkness like a beacon of hope. "Wake up," it whispered, its words echoing in my mind. "This is just a dream. You can escape if you believe." With a jolt, I opened my eyes to find myself lying in bed, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the window. It had all been a nightmare, a horrific vision that had felt all too real. But as I lay there, trembling and shaken, I knew that the memory of that night would stay with me forever. A reminder of the power of fear and the strength of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of nightmares. Relief washed over me as I realized I was safe in the comfort of my own room. Yet, the echoes of the nightmare lingered, refusing to fade away completely. I couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered in the shadows, watching and waiting for me to let my guard down. With trembling hands, I reached for the lamp on my bedside table and flooded the room with light, banishing the darkness that still seemed to cling to the corners. But even as the room was bathed in light, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at my insides. Determined to shake off the lingering fear, I forced myself to get out of bed and pace the room, willing my heart to slow its frantic pace. Yet, with each step, the feeling of being watched only intensified, as if the nightmare had left an indelible mark on my surroundings. Suddenly, a chill swept through the room, causing me to shiver despite the warmth of the light. I froze, my senses on high alert as I scanned the room for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own ragged breath echoing in the silence. With a shaky sigh, I forced myself to take a deep breath and calm my racing thoughts. It was just a nightmare, I told myself, a figment of my overactive imagination brought on by the stress of the day. There was nothing lurking in the darkness, waiting to drag me back into the nightmare realm. But even as I tried to convince myself of this, a nagging doubt remained, whispering in the back of my mind that the nightmare was far from over. and as I settled back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that midnight would bring another visit from the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of sleep. With a sense of trepidation, I lay back down, pulling the covers tightly around me as if they could shield me from the horrors that awaited in the dark. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one feeling like an eternity as I waited for the clock to strike midnight once again. As the appointed hour approached, I found myself holding my breath, half expecting the nightmare to return with a vengeance. But to my surprise, the room remained silent, save for the gentle hum of the ceiling fan. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave, soothing the frayed edges of my nerves. Perhaps it had all been a trick of the mind. I thought a momentary lapse into darkness that had now passed. With a weary sigh, I allowed myself to relax, the tension draining from my muscles as exhaustion finally caught up with me. Slowly, I felt myself drifting off to sleep, lulled by the rhythmic sound of my own breathing. But just as sleep began to claim me, a sudden noise shattered the silence, jolting me awake once more. It was a soft, barely perceptible sound, a whisper so faint that it could have been nothing more than the wind. Yet, there was something about it that sent a shiver down my spine, a sense of familiarity that made my blood run cold. It was the same whisper that had haunted my dreams, the same voice that had beckoned me into the darkness. With a sense of mounting dread, I realized that the nightmare was far from over, that the darkness that had plagued me in the mansion had followed me home, lurking just beyond the edge of consciousness. As the whispers grew louder, I felt a sense of panic rising within me, threatening to consume me whole. I knew I had to escape, to flee from the darkness that threatened to engulf me once more. With a surge of adrenaline, I leaped out of bed and raced towards the door, desperate to escape the nightmare that had followed me home. But as I reached for the handle, I froze, my hand hovering inches away from the cold metal. For just beyond the door, I could hear the whispers growing louder, their voices swirling together in a cacophony of darkness, and as I stood there, paralyzed with fear, I knew that the nightmare was far from over, that the darkness that lurked in the shadows would always find a way to claw its way back into my life. With trembling hands, I forced myself to grasp the doorknob and twist it open, revealing the hallway beyond, bathed in an eerie half-light. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out towards me with clawed hands. Heart pounding in my chest, I took a tentative step forward, my senses on high alert as I navigated the darkness that enveloped me. The whispers grew louder with each passing moment, their words unintelligible yet filled with malice and dread. I pressed on, driven by a primal instinct to flee from the darkness that threatened to consume me. But no matter how fast I ran, the whispers followed, their voices echoing in my mind like a twisted symphony of despair. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a staircase leading down into the depths of the house, an abyss of darkness that seemed to stretch on for eternity. With no other options left, I descended into the shadows, each step taking me further away from the safety of the world above. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a vast, cavernous chamber, a place of darkness and despair unlike anything I had ever seen. The walls were lined with ancient tapestries, depicting scenes of horror and torment, their faded images leering down at me with malevolent intent. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, upon which rested a single, flickering candle, a beacon of light in the sea of darkness that surrounded me. With a sense of trepidation, I approached the candle, its flame casting long shadows that danced across the walls. But as I reached out to touch it, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine, a presence lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I turned to face the darkness, only to come face to face with the source of the whispers. It was a figure cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by darkness as it loomed over me with an air of malevolence. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, fixing me in place with a gaze that seemed to pierce straight into my soul. With a sense of mounting horror, I realized that I was not alone, that the darkness had taken on a life of its own, manifesting itself in the form of this twisted creature. And as it reached out towards me with clawed hands, I knew that there was no escape, that I was trapped in its clutches forevermore. As darkness closed in around me, swallowing me whole, I knew that this was not the end, that the nightmare would continue for all eternity, a never-ending cycle of fear and despair. And as I screamed into the abyss, my voice drowned out by the whispers of the darkness, I knew that I would never escape the nightmare at midnight. With a trembling hand, I forced myself to turn the doorknob. The metal cold and unforgiving beneath my touch, the whispers grew louder, filling the air with their sinister melody as I slowly pushed the door open. The hallway beyond was bathed in darkness, the only illumination coming from the dim moonlight filtering through the windows. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock me from the darkness. Heart pounding in my chest, I took a hesitant step forward, each movement weighted down by the suffocating fear that gripped me. Every creak of the floorboards echoed through the empty corridor, sending chills down my spine. I knew I had to escape, to find a way to break free from the nightmare that had ensnared me once again. But with each passing moment, the darkness seemed to close in around me, threatening to swallow me whole. As I made my way down the hallway, I felt a presence looming just behind me, its icy breath sending shivers down my spine. I dared not look back, for fear of what I might see lurking in the shadows. Suddenly, a door creaked open ahead of me, revealing a staircase leading down into the depths of the mansion, with no other options left. I descended into the darkness, the whispers growing louder with each step I took. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a vast, cavernous chamber, a place of darkness and despair. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I could feel the weight of countless eyes watching me from the shadows. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I had stumbled upon the heart of the nightmare, a place where the darkness reigned supreme, and there was no escape. But even as fear threatened to consume me, a voice whispered in the back of my mind, a voice filled with courage and determination. It was a voice that reminded me that I was not alone, that as long as I held on to hope, there was still a chance to break free from the nightmare's grasp. With newfound resolve, I squared my shoulders and faced the darkness head-on, ready to confront whatever horrors awaited me in the depths of the mansion. For I knew that no matter how dark the night may seem, there was always a glimmer of light waiting to guide me home. The midnight shadow. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around me, as I stood at the edge of the forest, shrouded in an inky blackness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor like sinister spectres. With a shiver running down my spine, I forced myself to take a step forward, the leaves crunching beneath my feet echoing loudly in the silence of the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes followed my every move from the depths of the shadows. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to lean in towards me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched for any sign of escape from the suffocating darkness. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a towering silhouette cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backwards, the fear rising like bile in my throat. With a voice that seemed to resonate from the depths of the earth itself, the figure spoke. Its words filled with a sinister promise of doom. I tried to run, but my legs refused to move, as if held in place by some unseen force. Desperate, I reached out for anything to defend myself, my fingers closing around a jagged branch hanging on the forest floor. With trembling hands, I brandished it like a makeshift weapon, ready to face whatever horror lurked in the darkness. But as I swung the branch towards the figure, it dissolved into nothingness, leaving me defenseless against the encroaching shadows. With a scream of terror, I turned to flee, the darkness closing in around me like a suffocating blanket. I ran blindly through the forest, branches clawing at my skin. I fought to escape the clutches of the midnight shadow. But no matter how fast I ran, it seemed to follow, its presence looming over me like a spectre of death. Just when I thought I could run no further, I stumbled into a clearing, a small glimmer of light piercing through the darkness. Like a beacon of hope, with renewed determination, I raced towards it, the shadows falling away behind me like a receding tide. As I burst into the clearing, I found myself face to face with the source of the light, a small campfire burning brightly in the center. Relief flooded through me as I collapsed beside it, the warmth of the flames driving back the chill of the night. But as I sat there, catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting patiently for their next opportunity to strike. And as the flames flickered and danced in the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out towards me with clawed hands, I knew that the nightmare was far from over, that the midnight shadow would continue to haunt me for as long as I lived. As I sat by the campfire, the crackling flames providing a fleeting sense of comfort, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at my insides. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something ominous to unfold in the depths of the night. With trembling hands, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, hoping to find some solace in the familiar glow of the screen. But to my horror, the device remained lifeless, its battery drained and its screen blank. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was truly alone in the darkness, cut off from the outside world, and at the mercy of whatever malevolent force lurked in the shadows. Desperate for a way out, I scanned the clearing for any sign of salvation. That's when I saw it, a faint glimmer of light, flickering in the distance, beckoning me towards it like a guiding star in the night. With no other options left, I rose to my feet and began to make my way towards the source of the light, the darkness closing in around me like a suffocating cloak. As I drew closer, I could see that the light was emanating from an old cabin nestled at the edge of the forest, a solitary beacon of hope in the sea of darkness. With each step I took, the whispers grew louder, their words filled with malice and dread. But I refused to let fear consume me. I had come too far to turn back now. With a determined stride, I reached the cabin and pushed open the door, the hinges creaking in protest as I stepped inside. The interior was bathed in an eerie half-light, the shadows dancing along the walls like malevolent spirits. I could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on me, as if the cabin itself was alive with a dark and ancient energy. As I explored the cabin, I discovered signs of its former inhabitants: a table set for a meal, a bed with rumpled sheets, and faded photographs hanging on the walls. But there was something off about the place, something that sent shivers down my spine. And then I saw it, a portrait hanging above the fireplace, its subject staring back at me with eyes that seemed to follow my every move. The figure was cloaked in darkness, its features obscured by shadow, but there was no mistaking the aura of malevolence that surrounded it. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I had stumbled upon something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. The cabin was not just a refuge from the darkness. It was a trap, a prison for the lost souls who had dared to seek shelter within its walls. And as I stood there, paralyzed by fear, I knew that I was not alone, that the midnight shadow was closing in around me, ready to claim me as its next victim, with no other options left. I braced myself for the inevitable, knowing that the nightmare was far from over. The whispers grew louder, their voices swirling around me like a malevolent storm, urging me to flee before it was too late. But I refused to succumb to despair. I had to find a way to break free from the grip of the midnight shadow. With trembling hands, I searched the cabin for any sign of a way out, my heart pounding in my chest with each passing moment, but the walls seemed to close in around me, trapping me in a labyrinth of darkness with no hope of escape. Suddenly, I heard a noise of faint scratching coming from the floorboards beneath my feet. With a sense of trepidation, I knelt down and lifted one of the loose floorboards, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside, I found an old journal, its pages yellowed with age and filled with the ramblings of a madman. As I flipped through the entries, I realized that the cabin was not just a shelter, it was a prison for the souls of the damned, cursed to wander the earth for all eternity. But there was hope buried within the pages of the journal, a ritual that could banish the midnight shadow and break the curse once and for all. With newfound determination, I set about gathering the ingredients needed for the ritual, my hands shaking with anticipation. As the midnight hour approached, I stood in the center of the cabin, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the walls. With the journal clutched tightly in my hands, I began to chant the words of the ritual, each syllable resonating with ancient power. Suddenly, the air around me grew heavy, as if the very fabric of reality was shifting and warping in response to my words. I could feel the darkness recoiling, its grip weakening with each passing moment. And then, with a blinding flash of light, the midnight shadow was banished, its malevolent presence dissipating into the ether like smoke in the wind. The cabin was bathed in an otherworldly glow, the darkness replaced by a sense of peace and tranquility. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I knew that I had triumphed over the darkness, that I had broken free from the nightmare that had threatened to consume me. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I knew that I was finally free to leave the cabin behind and return to the world outside. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the midnight shadow still lingered, waiting for its next victim to stumble upon the cabin in the woods. And as I disappeared into the darkness, I knew that the nightmare was far from over, that the midnight shadow would always be there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light.